I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always are happily ever after.
Long ago and far away, there was once in the midst of a beautiful and mountainous country, an ancient and populous city. Many people lived and worked in this place, for its market was renowned for the variety of goods its traders sold, and for the quality of work its craftsmen offered. Within the city lived a young man whose family had been cobblers for generations. He was the best cobbler for miles, so everyone brought their boots and shoes to him to be repaired. All his life he had done nothing but stitch and nail and work in leather. He was conscientious and was never known to cheat his customers of a single penny. But the fact of the matter was that he was sick and tired of mending shoes day after day. He had visions of going out into the world, of slaying giants, of marrying beautiful princesses, of making friends with kings and potentates. He was sick of being just a cobbler. One day, he decided he would do something about it. If he wanted his life to change, then he was the person to do the changing. But he wouldn't do it by cheating or lying. His father had always taught that honesty was the best policy. But it didn't harm if one could stretch the truth and arrange matters in such a way that you could get what you wanted without exactly lying. So he put in hand a scheme he'd been mulling over for months. First, he bought a large piece of cheese, and then left it for days until it was riddled with maggots. Oh, what a horrid sight those creepy crawlies made! But he waited patiently until the cheese was covered with the creatures, and then started banging them as hard as he could with the flat of his shoe. He counted how many he had killed and how many he had wounded. When he was satisfied that he had killed a large enough number, he went to the marketplace once more and bought the most magnificent soldier's costume, complete with smart jacket covered with gold braid, a high-crowned cap, and a most fearsome-looking sabre. He had never killed anything in his life, apart from the maggots, but the sabre really did seem most businesslike. To complete the costume, he added a large French horn. He gladly parted with his last coins for such a fine outfit. He was convinced that with clothing like this, he would impress the king himself. And because he was a prudent young man, he prepared himself for his adventures by packing his cobbler's thread and needle, resin, and a small sponge he used for cleaning shoe buckles, together with some bread and cheese. Useful items that would enable him to work and eat wherever he went. Well, he looked quite the gallant soldier once he was arrayed in his finery. With high hopes and a great heart, he set off to offer his services to whichever king would have them. He hadn't gone very far when he came to a most imposing palace where surely a very important king must live. So he marched up to the guard as to the manner born and commanded the man to announce him to the king. The guard was most impressed by this brave-looking soldier and immediately led him to the king's council chamber, where the king was anxiously consulting with his advisers. The cobbler announced himself as the bravest soldier in the kingdom. And indeed, the king was very taken with this fine-looking young warrior. He appeared so fierce that the king was rather frightened of him. But the cobbler soon reassured the trembling monarch. "I've come to serve your majesty," the young man declared. "Whatever task you have, dragons to be slain, armies to be defeated, maidens to be rescued, I am your man. Why, at my last encounter, I killed hundreds and wounded even more." This was music to the king's ears, and the cobbler truly felt he was brave enough for anything. For just then he caught sight of the king's lovely daughter, with whom he fell immediately in love. "I have just the job for you," the king cried. "We are plagued by a fearsome giant that ravages our towns and lands and will not leave us in peace. Are you brave enough to kill him?" "He has the whole country in fear of him." "Certainly, your majesty, I can defeat him," the young man instantly replied, and the king was most impressed with his promptness. "I shall defend you to the death, your majesty, but in return, I ask for your daughter's hand in marriage. The reputation of her beauty has spread far and wide, and now I see it falls far short of reality." "If you defeat the giant, my daughter is yours," the king agreed without hesitation. "And I wish you well in your venture, young man." With those grateful words ringing in his ears, the young man set off on his hazardous quest. The giant lived a very long way away, in a great crumbling castle, set at the top of a tall mountain. The cobbler had no idea that the way would be so long and so hard. Oh, he got hotter and hotter in his heavy uniform as the sun beat down on his back. It wasn't until he paused to refresh himself at the mountain stream that he suddenly caught sight of the giant's gloomy home, lowering over the whole countryside. Slowly, the young man climbed towards it. He seemed to have lost all the bravery he possessed at the king's palace. He now felt very alone and very frightened. He had heard the most dreadful stories about this giant, how he squeezed the life out of men with just one hand, and how he then cooked his victims in a great big cauldron, and how he scattered their bones in the valley below. It had been all right boasting of his prowess to the king and the princess, but the cobbler knew his own shortcomings all too well, and silently prayed that his wits would be more than a match for the giant's great strength. He approached the castle with great caution. Who could tell what the giant would do or when he would appear? Why, he could be lurking around the next corner, ready to pounce on an unwary passerby. With all his nerves alert, his eyes wide, his ears a twitch for the slightest sound, the cobbler inched his way forward. But there was nothing to be seen. The castle appeared quite deserted. So the young man decided that there was no point in scaring himself with fancies while the giant was away. he would rest and have a bite to eat, and try and plan a stratagem to fool the giant. Making quite sure no one was around, the cobbler hungrily started on the frugal meal he had had the foresight to bring with him. And as he ate, he began to formulate a scheme to outwit his foe. He had fooled the king into believing he was brave and strong. Could he fool the giant too? Ravenous though he was, he didn't eat all his food. He moulded and formed a piece of the bread so it looked just like a piece of the rock he was sitting on. Suddenly, just as the sun was setting, he heard ominous sounds and could feel the ground tremble. Trees shivered and birds stopped singing. There in front of him loomed the giant, a terrifying sight. "What brings this pipsqueak here?" boomed the ogre. "Oh, you can't frighten me," the cobbler cried as bravely as he could. "Why, I've killed hundreds and wounded many more, all nastier and uglier than you. Watch me and tremble." He pretended to pull his piece of bread out of the rock and crushed it in front of the giant's astonished gaze. That certainly gave the ogre, who might have been big but who was not very clever, food for thought. Clearly this little man had more to him than met the eye. After considering, the giant growled quite mildly, "You had better come along with me, dwarf. I might spare your life, or I might not. In any event, I have work for you." He hustled the cobbler towards the castle. Of course, it had all been bravado on the cobbler's part. He was terrified of this fierce giant. Heaven only knew what fate lay in store for him in that dark and gloomy castle, and the giant was making quite sure that his prisoner didn't get a chance to escape. Up and up the crumbling staircase they climbed, higher and higher into the tower. No escape route presented itself to the frightened young man. In the giant's heavy grasp, he had no alternative but to do as he was told. At last, they entered the giant's lair, a cold and gloomy room where no warm sunlight had ever shone. "First we must eat," the giant cried heartily. "But as the soup is stone cold, we'll have to go out and gather firewood." He really meant, "You will work while I supervise." So off they went to the woods nearby. But all the while, the cobbler's brain was working furiously to devise a plan to outwit the giant's all too obvious intentions. "Oh, why waste time cutting wood?" he cried, "and messing around with twigs? I'll just pull up this tree here, and you can pull up that one there, and we'll have more than enough wood." The giant looked at the tree. It seemed enormous. That little man must have superhuman strength to pull up a tree that big. Better not," the giant said nervously. "On second thoughts, I'll just pick up a few branches, and that will be quite enough for the fire." So it was left to the giant to do the work after all, while the clever cobbler hid his glee at how well his ruse had worked. He began to realize that although the giant was big, his brain was small, and that if he, the cobbler, kept his wits about him and wasn't too frightened of the giant's strength, he may yet triumph over the ogre and win the princess's hand in marriage. Just to prove the point, he cunningly dampened his little sponge and pretended to squeeze the water out of the wood. "Why, all the wood you collected is damp," he scornfully told the giant. "The fire will smoke. How silly of you." The giant was beginning to get rather nervous of his saucy guest, and challenged him to a game of chess. The giant was proud of his skill as a chess player, but he really wasn't much good. He moved a pawn. The cobbler did the same. But the moment the giant moved his next pawn, he left the piece wide open to be taken by the cobbler's queen. And the game was over. The cobbler had won. "He's not only stronger than me, he's cleverer than me," the giant thought, and growled grumpily. "I don't want to play chess anymore." "But I do," the cobbler cried, pressing his advantage. "Don't you realize that I've defeated more giants at chess than you've had hot dinners?" The giant was most put out by this. He dimly realized that his guest was not at all like the run-of-the-mill prisoners that he'd captured in the past, and he needed time to think of a way of overcoming the little man. "I'll get some water for the soup," he muttered and slunk off, making sure that the door was securely locked and that his prisoner remained one. As usual, he placed the key on a ledge just above the door. But the young man had observed every move and realized immediately that this was where his cobbler's resin would be very useful. All he needed now was a long, straight stick, and the key was as good as his. Carefully but swiftly, he stuck the resin onto the end of the stick and cautiously lowered it out of the window. When it was level with the key, he had to be very careful in case he knocked the key away. But the resin stuck fast, and he was able safely to lift it and grab the key. When the giant returned, the first thing he saw was his prisoner taking his ease in the sun outside the locked door. "How did you get out?" the ogre asked, and the cobbler coolly replied, "I don't like being locked in, so I just put my shoulder to the door and forced it open. Much prefer being in the sunshine anyway." The giant was getting more and more worried about his unusual guest, and so much worry made him feel very sleepy. After the meal, he couldn't stop himself from nodding off, and that gave the cobbler another chance to demonstrate his agile wits. Using his cobbler's needle and thread, he sewed the giant's 2 boots securely together. Then woke him up by tickling his nose with a feather. He taunted the giant. "You say you're the strongest fellow in the kingdom, but look, I can knock you down with a feather." The giant jumped up with a roar of rage, not realizing that he was quite off balance. Quickly, the cobbler gave him a shove, and he tumbled over, knocked down with a feather. The giant was now determined to get rid of his tormentor at all costs. He told the cobbler that he always invited his guests to share his bed. Once they were safely tucked up, the giant pretended to be very sleepy, and with great yawns and groans, settled down to sleep. But the cobbler knew by now that the giant was up to one of his tricks. So pretending that he too was fast asleep, he slid silently out of the bed, making sure that the bed springs didn't so much as creak. Under the bed, he found a large marrow, which he quietly put in his own place. And covering it with the bedclothes, hid under the bed to wait for the fun. Sure enough, not 2 minutes passed before the giant also got up, happily confident that his tiresome guest was fast asleep. He reached for his enormous club. He brought it down as hard as he could on the sleeping form. "Take that, and that, and that!" he panted until the body appeared as flat as a pancake. Once again, the clever cobbler was much too fast for the slow-witted giant. Like lightning, the lad slipped into the bed while the giant's back was turned and covered himself with the bedclothes. When the exhausted giant came back to the bed, the cobbler stretched and yawned. To the giant's total consternation, he started complaining bitterly that he'd been bitten by fleas. The giant had had enough, more than enough. He rushed from the room, and it is a fact that he was never seen in those parts again. No one knew where he went, and nobody cared. As for the cobbler, he lost no time in bringing the giant's great club to the king. Everyone was most surprised to see him alive. And when he saw the club, the king's joy knew no bounds. Proudly, the cobbler announced that the giant would never trouble the kingdom again, and claimed his reward. The king was delighted to have his daughter marry such a brave and clever young man, while she too was happy to have such a handsome giant killer for a husband.